Now, for those of you staying here on Channel 1, I'm delighted to introduce our first session today, a new post-COVID reality for SMEs, sustainability as a business model, and Maja Göpel, Director of Research at the New Institute. Now, if you have any questions for Maja throughout her speech, please post them on the Q&A feed, which is on your live stream, and please state your name and what you do. Welcome, Maja Göpel. The floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much for this kind introduction. And I'm very, very pleased to be joining you this morning from Berlin through the new ways of connecting during these rather difficult times. And what I will try to do in these next 15, 20 minutes is to put forward some ideas from transformation studies about why it is very, very important to connect the big picture that I think especially Joseph Stiglitz has put out yesterday with our smaller pictures of who we are and what we do every single day, and to make this connection between the thinking and the way we look at the world and how we do things. And to very clearly set at the first stage, and this will be also my first slide, that it is always really, really important to look at the context, so basically the reality that is surrounding us, before we start looking at the best solutions. And this is why my whole presentation has the hashtag building forward. We've had a lot of talk about building back better. And I think it is very important that we let go of the back and really start looking at where do we want to go and what we might want to let go of in order for that new thing and this new reality to actually emerge and become a flourishing and a positive future to look forward to, and to see our own roles in creating that future. Because we quite often speak about the future coming. Okay, I've got the information. I need to mute myself.
Now we cannot hear you.
Okay, sorry. So the context within which we are currently living is the thing that we should look at first before we start thinking about the good solutions and what could be solutions to the challenges that we're actually facing. And what I like to say from the transformation point of view, we are really facing something like a new reality. And obviously my perspective has strong roots in the ecological crisis and in the ecological point of view on what is at stake on this planet, but it is always tied in with the human activity. And that is what the new term Anthropocene that was coined by Paul Crutzen to describe a new epoch tries to nail down. And it basically says that after 10,000 years of that we've called the Holocene, human activity, because we've become so many, and our intensity of exchanging with the planet and taking out of the planet and giving back to the planet in forms of pollution, of waste, of residuals from burning fossil fuels, has become so intense that humanity has become a changing force in the entire planetary Earth system. And this is a totally new reality for us to face. And it's been discussed quite strongly a few years even before coronavirus hit us. And I think coronavirus was one moment where we did understand two things of that new reality. One is that humans and nature are deeply connected. We've had now the relationships between cutting down a lot of biodiversity through the cutting down of forests on the habitat destruction of the animals, and thus the vicinity between humanity and animals becoming too tight for the typical separation of viruses living in the animals, not necessarily spreading onto humans. But also obviously a strong call from all of the health professions saying, if you really want to put health first, and that came out in May, do you want to look at the ecosystems? Because obviously we also saw that the high-risk patients today are the ones that were exposed to pollution, etc. So the intermingling between human health and planetary health has been brought strongly forward by the health professions, and planetary health diet, and such ideas are emerging now on the radar to try to really bring back that reality that we are biological beings and thus are intertwined with the other beings that are constituting the ecosystems around us. And what you can see in the Anthropocene as the kind of prime pattern, I would say, is something that kind of is familiar, I think, when we look on screens of economic performance and economic success, because it's this upward curve, the hockey stick curve, that also describes emissions. And this is indicating how strong humanity is now interfering with our planet, and thus is changing the way it regenerates itself, most of the ecosystems. And this is why, starting from a new reality, we really need to look at what we're doing anew. And I've brought several slides now with examples of this, and I would like to start with the next one, please. So this new reality really needs for us to understand that post or pre-COVID was not normal. So building back to anything that was pre-corona is not a good idea, because this is a slide that came out of the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report only in January, so just before we saw the virus spreading. And it very clearly shows that the anticipated biggest risks for economic performance in the next years, both in impact and likelihood, are very environmental. And the environmental ones have been moving up on that ladder in the last 10 years where the report was being done. And you see, I don't know why water is declared not an ecological but a social crisis, but you see out of the top 6, there are 5 that are related to environmental issues, and 1 is weapons of mass destruction. So there is a very clear business case there, and we've seen finance waking up to it as well, to consider this not only as a soft issue, nice to have, if it doesn't challenge growth, we should protect the planet, but it is a risk, it is the future of economic performance. If we don't get it right and we're running out of stable conditions under which resources can regenerate. And this is why we need new solutions. This is why we really need to look at what are the business models that can help us, A, regenerate the ecosystems to a stable condition. This is why the UN has called out the decade of regeneration and restoration of ecosystems. And at the UN General Assembly, only now in September, 60 global leaders have signed this petition to really put the restoration of ecosystems first in the way that we look at rebuilding economic structures and putting recovery funds into action. Now, we can all make our own judgments about how much that's happened for now to really internalize the ecological point of view into recovery funds. And I would like to go to the next slide to try to underline more why I think it is crucial to really look at everything that we do now, to update it, to have an ecological eye on it. So if we could switch. Could we get the next slide? Yes, thank you. Because once we start doing honest accounting, and this is also a study that's come out before the coronavirus hit, we do start seeing the business opportunities, and we do start seeing that we can actually do things a lot better than we're doing now. So we are definitely in the place to say we can improve the way that we're A, using resources, and B, that the outcomes are serving our people. This is a hidden cost of the global food and land use system. And this is why I think looking honestly of where we are today is the first and most crucial step for us to be able to understand which are the solutions and the innovations that can help us improve the way that we're doing things. And this is putting together, once you start calculating the health costs, calculating the environmental costs, calculating also economic costs that emerge from the destruction of local communities through a too globalized supply chain management, in some of the cases in agriculture, it's really hampering smallholders and their ability to continue existing. So once we factor this in as costs next to what we're accounting for as benefits or as returns in that sector, we have a net loss of $2 trillion. This is a global estimate. So once we start accounting honestly, we can see maybe what we've had is not necessarily something to want to go back to, but we can also see where are all the improvements lying that we can then look at finding solutions for. And this is why I want to continue on that thread with the next slide, please. So the new reality also depends on clarity in terms. I think it's really difficult today to talk about changing things unless you have, or without having to justify how it's going to impact growth. Whereas growth remains totally undefined beyond GDP. And we've probably had a bit of an input yesterday why GDP is not a good term if we want to really understand what is hiding behind possibly a V or L or W or U-shaped recovery curve when we only look at it with the current terms of measuring outcomes in forms of GDP. And this is a triangle by Herman Daly, and he's been a World Bank ecological economist in the 1990s as well. And he's been trying to differentiate between means and ends. And I think this is really crucial to not confuse means and ends in our current discourse so much, because GDP growth is a possible means to achieving the ultimate ends of ensuring well-being for people. And then we have ultimate means, which is this bioreactor of recreating the resources that we need for sustenance of humanity as biological beings. And everything in between is intermediate. And this is where innovation should go. And this is where we should be really rethinking how we're incentivizing, how we're organizing. What is the framework conditions for markets right now? What can entrepreneurs do easily? What is very difficult? Why is it so hard to internalize social and environmental costs into your production without that meaning that you're facing a loss of market share? Can we continuously grow and grow and grow the production? Or does there have to be a different way of investing and organizing cooperation between the public and the private in order to get out of a squeeze to grow ever more? And this is why we start with clarity of terms to see the solutions. And the next slide goes into what else the new reality needs. And I want to show you why it is so important that our choices are going to shape our future. Future is not coming towards us, we're making it. And those should have 3 images. So if you click again, I hope they'll appear. This is what we do when we put incentives that are aiming at wood production. It's been a good idea, but if you only go for incentivizing creating a lot of wood quickly, this is how your landscape's going to look like. And we've had a lot of forests burning down, as also here in Germany, because this is not a very resilient forest, and the soil is not very healthy underneath it. And then we've got a next possibility, if you click again, to say we're going to incentivize for climate change, for example, and this is what the RED program under the Kyoto Protocol has started doing, and we continue to paying for the sunk CO2. So what the nature takes out of the atmosphere in binding CO2 in plants and forests, you can get compensation for. But if that's the only thing you aim for, CO2, then you're probably going to build a lot of trees or plant a lot of trees and put a lot of plants that only go for CO2. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they fit in the ecosystem. It doesn't mean that they help biodiversity. It doesn't mean that they grow there well for the long term, because you're only aiming at the CO2. And this is why if you incentivize for the third thing, if you click again, it shows what can emerge if you go for payments for ecosystem services. Ecosystem services is wider. It really looks at biodiversity, at water circuits, at maintaining the soils, at also having a recreational beauty for humans to walk in. There's been a Millennium Assessment report in 2000 already on what ecosystem services mean for humans. So the choice of incentives and the choice of what we're trying to aim for is definitely impacting how this reality in the future will look and feel for us. And this is where I want to go on to the next one. Next slide, please. Because obviously that means it's going to challenge business models. This has been an outcome of trying to estimate from different business models what is the enterprise design idea, because that obviously is also impacting how you're looking for funding, what kind of products are likely to come out, what's your market size, where do you want to go? And I think especially small, medium-sized enterprises do stand a fair chance to have more tick boxes when it goes to where and who is going to benefit from this. Is this going to be resilient? How much can we look at really having a triple bottom line at least in there that looks at the social and the environmental? But what do business then also need in the framework conditions so that they can become the building forward normal the more they internalize the social and environmental consequences? And this is why it's so important, the next slide please, to look at transformation as something that Schumpeter would call creative destruction, but we can also call innovation that needs ex-innovation. And we're really at this point in time where transformation is emerging, because we really need to get out of a lot of those structural path dependencies we've set up. And it is important to look at this not only as your individual task, but from a systemic point of view of collaboration. And this is why this graph is trying to put this all together. This S-curve is a typically shaped way of looking at dynamic change that is non-linear, but it does have an acceleration point where changes become really fast and then is going to level off again. And this is what we're seeing right now. I mean, we've seen it in the COVID transmission of the virus. There's been a strong acceleration. We've seen it in the CO2 emissions, and we also see this pattern in transformation. And today is definitely the time where we're seeing a lot of, we're coming together of different forces of change. And you've seen the differentiation at the bottom. This way of looking at where we want to go is actually a big connecting piece between different actors in a system that are pushing towards the same direction. So you have pioneering activities. We've had a lot of good examples from businesses, but also from civil society, that we're saying we can do things better. So we have new technologies, we have renewables, we have food production chains that actually really want to compensate those that are producing the food really well. And then we've had tests and trials about how can governments support this? So what is the policy framework around this? So it becomes easier to do sustainable business. And now obviously we've got a stress from the outside, because we see that the whole ways that market supply and demand are working have been faltering in some sectors much more than others. And we do need public intervention to try to stabilize economic activity and to really look at how can we enable those to come out of this crisis that have built the best solutions. So the focus is always on the pioneering activities that deviate, positive deviance, from a status quo that it has this lose-lose system of costing us too much to be fit for the future. And ideally, this collaboration between regulatory change, between pioneer activity, between media that changes the discourse, between civil society that is buying products differently, but also telling politicians that they want the change, and receive the media and share the kind of new way of looking what is good business in the 21st century, can become a virtuous cycle. And that's the whole idea behind creative destruction, also liberating of the new, so it becomes easier to change. And this is where I'm concluding. Going into the next slide, please. To really think about this as a system innovation point of view. And this is a report that we've just tabled for the European Commission between Systemic and the Club of Rome. Systemic has emerged as a consultancy that only looks at things from a systems point of view, as it says in the name, and the Club of Rome has always had a systems point of view. And it's very clear for organizations that are trying to look at what is at stake today is that we have to start with redefining where we want to go. Really put the purpose first. And Ms. von der Leyen has had it in her speech to say we shouldn't confuse wealth with well-being any longer. So how do we redefine prosperity? How do we get natural resource use firmly onto the radar screen of what we're doing? How do we redefine progress? Make sure that it is really the people that are standing first in what emerges after the crisis. Redefining the metrics so we don't have single wood forests, but we really look at having thriving ecosystems. Redefining competitiveness. Why is the cheapest product the least cost, when cost means it's wages, that what we're aiming for? Redefining incentives. What do businesses need and how can they get their employees really excited about it? Or is it more the employees that are really excited, which I hear more and more as well, that are driving business choices? Redefining consumption, another key actor in the game. And redefining finance. Why push for the externalization of social environmental costs so much for the short-term financial return? Redefining governance, to be really sure that we have to change the way we do things in order to be able to change what comes out of them. And then ending with leadership that has been mentioned before. It starts in us. It starts in us saying things differently, seeing things differently, and looking at where the current structures stand in our way of creating the future that we'd like to see. And this is where my final slide brings it together, and I thank you all very much. Collaboration between policy and business is really crucial so that we actually enable all our human abilities to be constructing the future that we want rather than inhibiting us to get where we do want to go. Thank you.
Maja, that was a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much for that. Huge food for thought, I think, for everybody watching, and a real reality check, I think. And also, judging by the questions that have come in for you as well, a huge interest in what you just said there. I think one of the first questions, just remind people watching, when you do send in a question, if you wouldn't mind giving us your name and where you are and what you do as well, just to add to the process. But for now, we have a question. What would your message be to an SME that just really wants to go back to the comfortable growth path that it had before this dreadful pandemic? What would you say to those SMEs?
Well, it depends on their business model, right? Because we have some businesses, obviously, that are already putting forward the solutions that we need. And for them to say we want to increase our market share is part of changing how we do things. So I think growth in the macroeconomic space of saying it has to always be more of everything, and a structural change of what are the business models that are actually delivering on the things that we will continue to need, are two things to look at differently. And at the same time, it obviously needs, when you want to have a diversity of market players, which I think would be a good idea if we talk about market economy, then the share can't be too gigantic in order for diversity, and thus a degree of competition and then inspiration between the best solutions can be maintained. And so it is the how and the size that do go together. So it would be an answer that's a bit differentiated according to what this business is doing right now.
Another question from Jan Stahlberg, founder and CEO of Silicon Hagen, says, excellent points on diversity. Given that systems thinking is complex and seemingly costly, how do we make this point simple and easy to understand and implement both at policy level and at SME level?
Mm-hmm. Well, I found there's maybe two entry points that are most important. And one is on how we define the problem. And we've seen that very often also when we try to do transformation research and embed research in actual change in society. People don't like looking at the problem in any meaningful length to understand it from multiple points of view. And that would be the most important thing. Why is this problem persisting in particular? And not go for the very quick and easy answer, but to really try to think who should be part of the analysis. So bring all the system in the room, meaning everyone connected with that problem and having a stake in it. And then take your time to really understand, why is it persisting? The question why is for me the leading guidance in systems analysis. Why is this emerging? And why is this so? Why is this rule there? Who's put it there? Why has it become the rule, and when? So you always go back and trace to the origins, to roots. That's the essence of root causes rather than symptom fighting. And then obviously you put that out, the analysis from a broader point of view. And that I found, even though people are still hesitant because it means a lot more work, it shows you where there are additional solution possibilities, because you see connections between what you're doing and what others are doing. And sometimes when you don't find a solution, widening the system boundaries, so thinking bigger, can be exactly the key to finding something that is promising. And I've been talking a lot about this in government with us to say, look, in the economics ministry, you're looking at the access to resource strategy. And then in the environment ministry, you look at the resource efficiency strategy. So how do we actually take the resources and put them in a circular economy? You need to talk together if you really want to understand the system. And then you can also really think about new ways of being able to influence, because it's your possibility and your responsibility and your task to be influencing levers that someone that has been looking at this before didn't have. So widening the system means you have more potential, you have more collaboration potential, you have more levers at your hands. And this is why I always use it as an invitation to say you can actually be more effective. Yes, it means doing things differently. It costs more energy in the first step, but it can really unleash some of the things you found difficult before.
And the next one, and the final question, unfortunately, for today is really about the future. Julius Storell, who represents over 33,000 junior entrepreneurs, wants to know, what do you think the role of the next generation entering the labour market is towards much more sustainable business models? What's their role, I suppose, in facilitating that?
Well, the generational shift, I think, is a fantastic opportunity, both in terms of a legitimacy to say we want to look at it from a new way that is different to, I mean, some identities are really vested in a particular way of doing things. And we all know this from our own experiences, that it's really hard to let go of some of the things that you become very familiarized with, or that have been key to your identity and what people have conceived you for as successful. And so generation shift can mean that some things can change much more radically without this meaning that anybody has to lose face or anybody really has to say, I've done things that are now not valid anymore. So if we have dignity and acceptance and appreciation in change processes, I think that is a very crucial thing on a very personal level that can allow for much more, or leaping forward in a different way. It means the letting go and the emergence go hand in hand and are thanking each other.
Well, Maja Göpel, thank you so much for leading a fascinating first session. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to introduce you to our graphic recorder, Sabine, who will share her graphical interpretation of Maja's words with us.
Thank you, and hello from Frankfurt. Maja, I have tried to listen deeply to your great presentation. And so it is really about us looking at the bigger picture and seeing the context. So you have explained that we are now in the Anthropocene, where humanity and nature are deeply connected. And we see that in this moment through the pandemic with the planetary health, which is so connected to the human health. And you have spoken about all the risks which are beyond the pandemic, very clear and crucial. And the different models. So what do we need to look at? The hidden costs, what that we need to differentiate between means and ends, and to take a systemic approach of collaboration where we focus on pioneering activities and include civil society to really make the right choices about which ecosystem are we looking at. And I will continue to draw this even more, but it's really what I've heard. Your main message was to put purpose first, to ask always why, to take a different perspective on our problems and to dare to think bigger. Is there anything you want to add?
I think I would like to add two things: that dreaming is allowed, and that you should never underestimate how many people are already thinking in that direction.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you, Maja Göpel, for that excellent presentation, and Sabine Sutter for bringing to life the context and the connections of this really precious thinking. So thank you very much for that. Now, I'd like to invite all the delegates to meet in small breakout groups in the networking room to discuss really what you've heard this morning and what resonates most with you. There's a huge amount there, so I'm sure you've got a lot to talk about. So for those of you who haven't visited our networking rooms yet, you're free to join whichever room you choose and to join whichever conversation you find, but as long as there are no more than around 15 people in that conversation. And then we'll come back together in the next session to hear the insights and ideas that you've shared. So please choose your room and let's discuss how SMEs can be drivers in the transition towards a sustainable economy and how we support them. And feel free, of course, to share your ideas on the forum as well. I wish you wonderful conversations. See you all back here at 10:10 again on Channel 1. Enjoy.